here's how it works. Okay, number one, you're going to identify the objective. What is the objective? So it's either to pass the oral, pass the check ride, pass a phase validation, or a gate. Commonly, if you don't know what that is, there's several carriers that will actually give you a gate or a phase validation, which is kind of to be thought of maybe as a mini check ride. Not really a check ride, it's a small checking event where they're seeing if your progress up to this particular point in the training program has been satisfactory so that you can continue on through the rest of it, right? So identify what the next checking event is, what the objective is. I pass an oral, pass a check ride, pass a phase validation or a gate. Number two, identify targets for successful completion of the objective. So for example, for an oral, it would be memory items, limitations, systems knowledge. Maybe for a check ride, of course, you need call-outs, flows, right? Profiles and procedures, air work. Look, whatever maneuvers or whatever needs to be satisfied to meet the main objective, to pass whatever checking event happens to be. Number three, you're going to identify proper tools to use for study for preparation. Could be our videos, audio programs, this very playbook, this very video program or audio program if you're listening to it. Maybe it's one-on-one coaching with myself or Juan or one of our one-step prep instructors here at our facility. Just reach out. Okay, manuals could be good aids, of course, CBT partners, other instructors, colleagues, all these things. These are tools and resources and you want to use them all and use them effectively to the best of your ability. Number four, identify order of priority to study. So what order of priority do I need to implement? What's the prioritization, if you will, to study these things effectively? Number five, identify time needed to be spent on each item. How much time do I need to allocate towards each item? More time on your weaker areas preferably, of course. And number six, draw a timeline to make this tangible, make it physical, something to look at and hold you accountable to sticking to it. And number seven, finally, we're going to add in pie charts to show the time allocation. Now, in this very playbook, and I know if you're listening on audio or something to that effect, you're not going to be able to actually see it. And perhaps maybe what we'll do is throw it up on the screen here so you can see it. But nonetheless, what it is a time allocation plan. And it looks a little something like this, okay? You basically have your start date and you have your finish date. And we have the checking event here and a checking event here, which is typically your oral and then later on your type write. And if you're listening to me on audio, all I have is basically a line with two X's on it, an X on the end, an X at the one end and an X on the other end, right? And so I'm showing, of course, as mentioned, the start and the finish of your training program. And what you're truly looking for here is, okay, where's the checking events, and then what items need to be studied for, and then furthermore, what time am I going to allocate towards each item? If you're following along with the playbook, you'll see the time allocation plan here, where I actually have a pie chart with exact values that lay out, hey, maybe I want to study 33% to memory items, 33% to limitations, 33% to license switches, or maybe I want to do 40% to systems, maybe I want to do 30% to limitations, 30% to memory items. So I guess my point is, depending upon your background and what you feel is required for you, that's how you should study effectively, most effectively. Now let me go through the time allocation plan that I have here, the timeline on the playbook, where I actually outline your systems study to be 40% and memory items and limitations to be 30% apiece. So your memory items is going to be 30%, your limitations is going to be 30%, and your system study will be 40. Now you notice the memory items and limitations, if you add them both together, the 30 and the 30, that's 60% of your oral. Sound familiar? So you're studying, the majority of your time is spent studying memory items and limitations as opposed to the systems, which comes later, 40%. Now once you pass your oral down later on the timeline, you're going to find yourself breaking up your time a little bit differently, whereby you're going to study call-outs for 20%, profiles 20% of your time, non-normal procedures and automation, checklists and flows, and you're breaking up your time a little bit differently because, well, this checking event is already behind you, the oral, so your memory items and limitations study and your license switches study is now behind you and you're progressing forward with other things. Now, one thing I would like to bring up, and perhaps what we'll do is just drop, like I said, this timeline on the screen here for you to see. You notice there's a point in training right where your oral and your fixed base happen to line up here. And I have there a note in a red box that basically says this area can bring trouble since you're having to combine both oral and sim prep topics. And remember that without passing the oral, there is no sim. So focus on your oral, and then later on we're going to apply more focus towards the items that are going to come in the sim. This timeline that is in this, it's illustrated in this book, this reflects a typical 142 training program footprint. And your footprint may vary from this. It may be slightly different. But I guess what I'm suggesting here, what I'm suggesting is that if you happen to have SITs or fixed base sims that are coincident or coincident with your oral, just ensure that you don't start to feel overwhelmed, because the material and the topics and the subject matter and everything you're studying for SIT will be different than what you're studying for your oral, and you don't want to overload yourself, and always prioritize with, well, what's the checking event? The oral is the checking event. So continue to prioritize this. Don't completely neglect this, but just be mindful of this potential barrier as you work through your training footprint. Look, the time allocation footprint that we just went through, this is my recommended time study plan going into day one of training. Again, if you're listening to this on the audio version of this, or if you don't have the playbook and you only got in the video portion, please go grab it right now, because the footprint that's there is for your benefit, and of course this book is for you to be able to refer to it throughout the course of your career as a professional aviator. So it's going to benefit you ultimately, and that's what we're looking for. Look, this assumes also, by the way, this time allocation plan assumes that you've already begun reviewing systems of the aircraft that you will be studying before beginning training. So the time allocation footprint, one more time, it assumes that you have some working knowledge to a certain degree, to a, not necessarily, like I said, that you're planning on how many, you can answer how many rivets are on the tail, anything like that, but you've had some prep work placed already on the systems and their workings, and that time allocation plan would assume that you have that. Otherwise, it would be a little bit more towards the systems first, and then you can pick up with that time allocation plan. Okay, so let's continue on here. Look, everyone is different. Results vary depending on background, your study discipline, your own personal self-discipline, right, and other factors, where you're studying, your home environment, your perhaps maybe your personal life, you have something going on, anything like that. But ask yourself, where do I need to be and where am I, right? You need an extremely high level of self-awareness. What are my expectations of myself? Where do I need to be and where am I actually right now? And if there's a disparity between the 2 points that is quite large, create a study timeline, meet the targets, and even if it's not a big one, if there's any disparity at all, you need a plan, you need some blueprint, plan of action to keep you on course. Let's continue on now with the training roadblocks segment of this playbook. And in the training roadblocks, well, we're going to talk about training roadblocks, right? The training roadblocks, there's various problems. Okay, training roadblocks, there's various problems that arise for most pilots. Let me list them out here kind of in a list. This is not necessarily an order of priority, just a general list of roadblocks or common weak points that we find. Number one is insufficient system memory item and limitation knowledge. And of course, up till this point, we've been hammering that quite significantly. Number two, failure to push back from the gate in 20 minutes or less. Number three, checklist responses are not memorized. Preferably you have those memorized. Number four, ineffective briefings. Number five, poor callouts. 6, poor stick and rudder ability. Number 7, poor understanding of the automation. This one's huge. Cannot tell you how much of this we see, where there be lack of familiarity with managed versus selected modes in the case of a 320, LNAV, VNAV in the case of a 7.3, what buttons to push on the MCP or the FCU to comply with various clearances. We see this quite often, so lack of automation, understanding, and knowledge is a big one. Number 8, lack of FMS knowledge, also quite large. It kind of ties in with your automation. Number 9, single engine ILS approach, and number 10, huge single engine go around. And I would easily be able to tell you that the single engine go around is quite honestly the number one most retrained maneuver in training programs. It's usually that single engine, could even be the single engine ILS, and the phases that kind of lead into the go around, and that's particularly because you're applying a lot of thrust with a relatively low speed and a high angle of attack, and we'll get into the exact technicalities of why that is here in just a little bit. So now that you know the top 10 roadblocks, let's dive into each one and understand how you can avoid them entirely. We're going to start with the first one. The first one was insufficient memory items and limitations knowledge. Insufficient systems, memory items, and limitations knowledge. The number one solution to this is time invested plus effective methods employed. Let me say it again. Time invested plus effective methods employed. Let me elaborate, right? The only way to absorb systems knowledge and to memorize the memory items and limitations is to invest time and effort into it. And now you already know this, of course, because, well, obviously you wouldn't be getting up programs or investing time watching this, right? But truly what it boils down to is optimizing this time. Let me provide an example for you, right? You should memorize 3 to 4 memory items per day. I tell people usually 3 to 4 memory items per day and 3 to 4 limitations per day. So I'm giving you the exact blueprint, the exact spoon-fed. It gets no simpler than this, right? Memorize 3 to 4 memory items a day, 3 to 4 limitations per day. Before, preferably, your training program if you have the material. And if not, then immediately upon getting the material, the second you get your hands on it, this is when you want to start this. Look, start with these 2 items first, because the systems discussion later will happen after you cover these 2 items in your oral. Remember, your oral memory items limitations first, systems discussions coming later, which is why we call these 2 items the tone setters, right? They set the tone for how the rest of your oral will go. And I will recommend selecting a memory item and reciting usually the first 3 steps to yourself, just over and over and over again. Recite the first 3 steps, then adding a 4th, and then repeating. And then you add the 5th, and you repeat. And look, I think you get the point, but we're basically suggesting that you start with a few items, repeat them until you're comfortable, and then start adding on. And you're going to do this at least for 3 memory items each day until you're oral. So let's say in the case of a engine fire, severe damage 7.3, auto throttle if engaged, disengaged, thrust lever affected engine confirm closed, start lever affected engine confirm cut off. Those are the first 3 items of the memory item, and you're going to want to recite them, those first 3 items, over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. Right? In the case of a TCAS RA, for example, on an A320, right? Autopilot off, flight directors off, and then comply with RA. Autopilot off, flight directors off, comply with RA. And you're basically going to recite them over and over and over. And then once you recite the first 3 items, then you tack on number 4. And you start back over, do the first 3, add number 4. And you do that a few times. And you tack on number 5, right? Do the first 3, tack on number 4, then add number 5. And you repeat the same thing over and over. So hopefully you get the picture. I think you do, and we're trying to give it to you as spoon-fed as possible right here. Look, systems should be studied using our video prep. And, you know, I say that with full confidence that I truly believe, Juan truly believes, we truly believe here at One Step Prep, it is by far, hands down, the #1 best study tool out there. It's the most effective use of your time. Manuals, while good, they're compliant. It doesn't necessarily mean they're quality training tools, right? So systems should be studied using our video series. I very, very highly recommend that, right? Now, look, you may think, of course, Joe, of course you'd recommend that. Of course you'd recommend your own product. But the truth is, the knowledge that we pour out on that program is truly the fastest way to absorb and retain the needed data to breeze through the systems discussion segment of your oral. You can also use traditional manuals, just like I mentioned. If you elect this route or this route, I would recommend studying 2 systems per day, understanding every light, every switch, the auto logic, how each system ties into the others. Also pose probable questions to yourself and provide hypothetical answers that will show the examiner in minimal words that you do indeed understand the system. We cover this on our type rating video prep series as well. So we give you the knowledge plus a delivery so that ultimately it'll equal your success. Focus on first understanding, number 1. First understand, number 2, deliver. Number 2, second training roadblock here, failure to push back in 20 minutes or less. Look, this is a very common problem and roots from something you've already learned earlier in this playbook. What is it, you may be asking? Operating on a level of unconscious competence. Look, remember the levels of competence we went through, right? There was 4 of them. So the levels of competence that we went through suggested that you either, number 1, you were unconsciously incompetent, didn't know what you didn't know. You were consciously competent or consciously incompetent. You knew what you didn't know, followed by consciously competent. You now know and can do it, assuming you're performing the task with 100% focus. And then finally, number 4 was unconscious competence, where you can actually perform the tasks with minimal concentration or being consciously focused on it. So if you don't remember that, go back. You can re-listen to this or rewatch it, or if you're in the playbook, just back up a few pages. But basically, you're not yet, when you're not able to push back out of the gate in 20 minutes, you're not yet proficient enough at the pre-flight tasks, and therefore your pushback is delayed. So you're operating on a lower scale, or a lower step of the 4-step ladder, if you will. And this can include competence, lack of competence and flows, checklist responses, FMS loading. It could be departure briefing. Break down each segment of the pushback sequence, one by one by one by one. Just break down each one, and then assess your comfort level on each one. How do I feel on the cockpit, the preliminary pre-flight? How do I feel on the electrical power of the preliminary pre-flight? How do I feel on the captain's pre-flight flow or the first officer pre-flight flow? How do I feel on my departure briefing? How do I feel briefing the flight attendants? How do I feel on the air traffic control ATC communication exchange between cockpit to ground and RAM control and ground control, etc.? The focus on that area that needs your attention, and then believe me, you should see your time getting out of the gate improve greatly. Number 3, checklist response is not memorized. Okay, this is an easy fix. It's 1 word, repetition. Checklist response is not memorized. It's simple. Just repeat over and over and over. Go through the checklist, preferably with your partner, over and over and over and over again. Chair fly together with them in front of a paper trainer. Get used to scanning around the cockpit for items that the checklist calls for. And when you can predict what the next item on the checklist will be, you will have no issue pushing back.